Of course. Here is the paraphrase script. Maintaining your original articulate and suspenseful style will subtly alter the word order and structure of the sentence. نجمة. In a remote corner of southeastern Ohio, during the winter of 1856, three newborn boys entered the world under circumstances so extraordinary that medical professions still debate their case in hushed tones today. It was in the head basement of a Quaker meeting house, on one of the most dangerous nations in the Grand Railroad history, that these triplets developed abilities defied the free law of human psychology and physiology. For over a century, their descendants have coded secrets about what those boys could do. Secrets that, if revealed, would force us to reconsider everything we thought we knew about the limits of human perception. Never told that say the family records, never documented in any official medical journal, and never spoken of in any academic circles what I'm about to share with you. Deliberately buried, the evidence nothing comes late today. Before we dive deeper into this chilling account that begins in the shadows of America's most secret rescue network, I need to know something about you. This channel isn't for everyone, but only for those brave enough to confront mysteries that challenge the very foundations of what we believe possible. If you're one of the few who can handle stories beyond the line between documented history and inexplicable phenomenon, hit that subscribe button right now. And while you're at it, drop a comment telling me what set you listen from. I want to know where my fellow mystery seekers are gathered today. Because what you're about to hear happened not in some distant mystical land, but right here in America, in communities that might be disturbingly close to you. The story I'm about to tell you began on a bitter February night when three lives entered the sword in the most unlikely place imaginable, certain motion events that would perplex doctors and scientists for generations to come. The town of Seed Mills, Ohio, in 1856, barely deserved the name. With a population half further than 300 souls, it consisted of little more than a cluster of modest homes, a general store, a blacksmith shop, and the simple brick meat that served for the local Quaker community. Unlike their more demonstrative Christian neighbors, the Society of Friends in Cedar Mills practiced their faith quietly. Their plain dress and solemn demeanor reflected a deep commitment to simplicity and, most importantly, to the radical belief that all human beings were equal in the eyes of God. This conviction had transformed their meeting house into something far more dangerous than a place of worship. It had become Starish 14 on the Underground Railroad, a crucial stop for freedom seekers making their way north from Kentucky and Virginia. Elder Samuel Whitmore, a man whose withered hand spoke of decade work in the soil and whose perseverance held secret that could hand half the congregation, had been conducting this clandestine work for nearly 80 years. Beneath the metal house's plain wood floors lay a carefully concealed bathroom, access through a trapdoor hid beneath the speaker's platform. A marvel of desperate engineer was the basement itself. Decked by hand-over months of careful work, it stretched nearly the full length of the building above. Thick wood beams supported the ceiling, while ventilation came through an ingenious system of hollow fence posts that appeared decorative but carried fresh air to those hidden below. On any given week, a newer for 15 freedom seekers made shelter there, some for a single night, others for weeks, as they waited for safe passage to the next stage. February of 1856 had been particularly treacherous. The fugitive left of 1856 had emboldened slave catchers who roamed freely through Ohio's legal authority to claim human property. Professional bounty hunters like the notorious Carrot brothers had been spotted in the area for weeks, offered substantial reward for information and the Grand Railroad operation. So thick was the tension Cedar Mills you could almost taste it. Every unexpected visitor, every knock at the door after dark, every unusual sign could sicken discovery and imprisonment. It was against this backdrop of fear and secrecy that a young woman had arrived at the meeting her 3 days earlier. She had given her name only as Ruth, claimed to be 19 years old, and was obviously with child, very much with she. Samuel Whitmore had taken one look at her soul barely and known immediately that she wouldn't be traveling any further north for quite some time. What he had expected was just how soon that she would arrive, or her profound rifle would change the phrase they thought they knew about human nature. From a plantation in northern Kentucky, Ruth had come, she told them in whispered conversation during her first nights in the basin. She spoke with the careful diction of someone who had been taught to read, unusual for someone in her circumstances, and carried herself with a dignity that impressed if they so quicker. But there was something else about her, something that made people uneasy without quite understand why. She seemed to know things, small things, but disturbed in their accuracy. Long before any sound could be heard, she would know if someone was approaching the meeting house. She would refuse food that later proved to be spoiled, though it had appeared perfectly fresh. Most unsettling of all, she would sometimes look directly at who before speaking and quietly contradict their words, not argumentatively, but with the calm certainty of someone who simply knew better. That man who brought this supplies yesterday, she had said it Samuel's wife, Morris, on her second defender there. He told you his name was Williams, didn't he? And that he was from Lancaster. Morris had nodded, confused. His name isn't Williams, Ruth had continued, her face barely above a whisper. And he's never been to Lancaster in his life. I don't know why he let you, but he did. Morris had dismissed this as the paranoid rambling of a frightened break into until 9 days after when the man's real identity was discovered. He was indeed using a false name. Man had been asking suspicious questions about the meeting house activities. The night of February 23 وردي 1856 began like many others in Cedar Mills, cold, dark, and deceptively quiet. Samuel Whitmore had been conducting his evening prayers when a soft knock came at the meeting house door, followed by the incredible signal, 3 crabs, a buzz, then 2 more. But from the moment Samuel left the healthy wood beam that brought the door, something felt wrong. The freedom seeker who stumbled inside was a man named Joshua, someone Samuel had helped before. But Joshua's usual calm demeanor had been replaced by barely controlled panic. They're coming, Joshua gasped, his breath forming with kisses in the frigidaire. The Carrot brothers and at least 6 others. They've got dog than they know about this place. Someone talked. He paused, his eyes darted toward the basement entrance. There might be 2 others behind me, probably less. Samuel felt his blood turn ice. In 8 years of underground railroad work, there had never faced a direct threat like this. The meeting house had always been considered safe, protected by the community's reputation for honesty and their careful operation secure. But if the Carrots were coming with dog than advanced knowledge of the basement, someone had indeed betrayed them. The immediate problem was evacuation. There are currently 7 people sheltered in the basement, including Ruth, who had been experiencing intermittent labor pains for most of the day. Morris Whitmore had been monitoring her condition but had hoped the birth wouldn't come for at least another week. Mother Nature, however, sent half other plans. As summoned by Joshua's words, a low moan could fall beneath the floorboards. Morris's face went by. Samuel, she whispered. Ruth's time has come. Right now. The next few hours unfolded like a nightmare caused for mess and fear. While Samuel and 2 other men worked frantically to evacuate the other 6 freedom seekers through the meeting houses head northern 10, a hand-deck passage that emerged nearly a quarter-million in a dense grove of oak trees, Morris and her daughter Beck descended into the basement to tent Ruth's labor. Walk the elephant in that combat, dimly its best child the free sambish they held the bed-shade birth. Ruth was indeed in active labor, but something was profoundly wrong. She was experiencing none of the usual signs of distress or pain that can be in difficult births. Instead, she lay perfectly still on the rough mattress, her eyes closed, her breathing steady and controlled. When contractions came, she did create a rift in her muscles. She simply waited as if listened to something only she could hear. How am I any babies? Morris asked, breath of her rare true soul belly in the traditional way of midwives. Ruth's eyes opened for the first time in a. In the flickering candlelight, they seemed almost luminous. 3, she said simply. 3 boys. They've been waiting for 10. Morris exchanged a worried glance with her daughter. Triplets were enough under the best circumstances, but triplets born in a head basement to slave catchers approached with blood hands was a situation beyond anything in her experience. More troubling was Ruth's certainty about the baby's gender and her strange comment about them what. They couldn't bolt children with for anything. The sound of horses in the distance cut rumors confused. Samuel's face could do from above. They're here. The ten is clear, but we can't rest more for us now. What happened next was recorded in Morth Whitmore's brief journal, a document that remained hid in her family for over a century before being discovered in 2003 door their anniversary of Node from us. Recorded at Hurricane, written just days after the events, Ross Silber accelerated dramatically the moment his captures arrived at the meeting house. But it accelerated in a way that defied medical understanding. The first baby was born in complete silence. No crying, no sound at all, except for Ross' barely audible breathing. Morse caught the infant, a perfectly formed boy, and was started to find him already breathed normally, his eyes open and alert. Before she could even cut the umbilical cord, the second baby arrived, he can tot sales, he can breathe anywhere from the moment of birth. The third followed less than a minute later, completed what Morse described as the most natural birth I have ever witnessed. But the strangest part was yet come. As Morse worked to clean and wrap the three infants, footsteps and voices could be heard directly above them. The Carrot brothers had entered the meeting house and were conducting a thorough search. Heavy boats ought to cross the wood floors just feet above the nobles' heads. At one point, someone stood directly on the trapdoor that concealed the basement entrance. Throughout this entire time, with strange women and tracking dogs just above them, the three babies never made a sound. Not a cry, not a whimper, not if the sound was that of nobles might. They lay perfectly still in their mother's arms, their identical doorways moving back and forth as if following the movement of the searchers above. It was as if they somehow understood that their surface depended on absolute silence. Ross never spoke during the search. According to Morth's journal, she simply held her three sons and whispered to them in a language that sounded like no dialect Morth had for her. Later, Morth would describe it as words that seemed to flow like water, soft and continuous, like a river run over stones. The search lasted nearly 3 hours. The Carrots were thorough, methodical, and increasingly faster. They checked every room, every closet, every possible hiding place. Their dogs sniffed around the meeting house's foundation and scratched at the floorboards in several places, but they never found the letters to the basement. And eventually, they left, cursed their informant for providing bad information. It was only after the sounds of horses had faded completely into the distance that the three babies finally made their first sounds. And when they did, all three cried in perfect unison, their voice blended into a single haunted wail that seemed to come from the fiery walls of the basin. Ross died less than an hour later, from bleeding that Morse couldn't stop, despite all her experience with difficult births. Her last words, spoken so quietly that Morse had lain close to hear them, were, "They'll know things. They'll always know. Take care of them, but remember they're not like other children." The death of Roth left the Quaker community of Cedar Mills facing an impossible situation, 3 newborn boys with no father, no family, and no legal existence. Slave children born free on Ohio soil, but with no documentation to prove their stats. Samuel Whitmore made the decision that would shape the rest of his life. The community would raise the boys collectively, each family taking turns caring for them, but all share the responsibility for their upbringing. In the Quaker tradition, the boys were named by the community, Caleb, Razor, and Isaac. Through the race days, it was clear that Ross' fine words had been more than the rifles of a dying womb. The 3 boys were indeed not like other children, but in ways that were set enough to be dismissed as coincidences by the new not watch up those 3. Morth Whitmore, who had taken primary responsibility for the boys' care during their first year, began keeping detailed notes about their behavior. These notes, discovered along with her birth journal, provide a disturbing glimpse into the early manifestations of the boys' unusual abilities. At 6 months old, the triplets had developed a habit that unnerved their caregivers. They would all turn their heads in the same direction at exactly the same moment, or focus around empty doors or windows where no one was visible. When someone eventually appeared in those locations, sometimes minutes later, it was always a person who was upset, angry, or hated something. The boys seemed to sense emotional stress long before any adult could detect it. By their first birthday, the pattern had become possible to know. The triplets could identify lies with an accuracy. When community members spoke to them, the boys would respond normally to truthful statements but would turn away and refuse to engage with anyone who was being dishonest, if the battlefield matters. At first, they did find this amusing, even hypothetical. If someone claimed to have completed a chore that actually forgot, the boys would immediately know. If a visitor to the meeting has kept a false name or mislead information about their background, the triplets would become agitated and refused to go near that bus. But the ability was more than simply detection. As the boys grew older, they seemed to sense this ambition in all its forms, not just spoken lies, but hidden intentions, concealed emotions, unspoken plans. Samuel Whitmore wrote in his brief correspondence, "It is as if the boys can see directly into the human heart and know what lies there." This would be a blessing perhaps if it did not seem cause them such distress. They are constantly aware of the small falsehoods and hid thoughts that all people carry, and this knowledge appears to be a burden rather than a gift. More disturbing were the boys' reactions to specific types of deception. They showed particular distress surrounding anyone who was hiding information about Mr. Burses or concealed files. During the second year, a traffic merchant named Tom Bus stopped at the meeting and has claimed to be headed to Columbus on business. The triplets became so agitated in his premises that they couldn't sleep or eat until he left. 2 weeks later, news arrived that Tom Bus had been arrested for the murder of his business partner, whose body had been concealed in Tom Bus's work during his visit to Cedar Mills. By lead 3, the boys had developed the community began calling the known rock, a shark branch that would double focus on someone who was hiding something significant. All 3 would turn their heads simultaneously, their door key seemed to penetrate whoever had detected their attention. Most unsettling was their habit of whispering at each other during these episodes, or within that strange foreign language that Ruth had used during their birth. Dr. William Harris, the local physician who had been monitoring the boys' development, was both fascinated and disturbed by their abilities. In a letter to a colleague at the Medical College of Ohio, he wrote, "I have examined these children repeatedly and can find no physical abnormality that would account for their unusual perceptive abilities. Their hearing, speech, and other senses appear normal, though perhaps slightly more acute than average, yet they consistently demonstrate knowledge of matters that should be beyond their perception. I am forced to conclude that either these children possess some form of sensory capacity known to medical science, or I am the victim of an elaborate deception. Though a 3-year-old child could maintain such a deception is beyond me understand." The boys' impact on the Underground Railroad operations was immediate and profound. Word of their ability spread quickly through the network stations and conductors. Freedom seekers began requested specifically to be routed through Cedar Mills, knowing that the boys could identify infiltrators and betrayers with perfect accuracy. The triplets' presence in the meeting has become a guarantee of safety. If they remained calm and peaceful, the freedom seekers know they will remain friends. If the boys became agitated or refused to enter the basement, it was a certain sign that someone in the group couldn't be trusted. Samuel Whitmore found himself in the uncomfortable position of relying on 3 young children for the security of one of Ohio's most important underground railroad stations. But the boys' accuracy was undeniable. Over the course of the last years, they identified self-potential infiltrators, preventive who could have been catastrophic discoveries of the network's operation. But their abilities came with a brace that became more apparent as they grew older. The boys were increasingly isolated from other children, who found their intense and whispered converses uncertain. Adults in the community, while careful for the British the boys preferred, could check the feeling that they were being constantly evaluated and judged. If the most honest people felt uncomfortable under the triplets' watchful eyes, knowing that referee thought an emotion was somehow visible to them. Most trouble was the boys' growing awareness of their own abilities and the effect they had on others. By age 4, they had learned to modify their behavior around strangers, keeping their known looks set and their whispered consultations brief. But this self-consciousness seemed deep in their isolation, creating a barrier between them and the rest of the world that grew more pronounced with each past year. The year 1866 brought challenges to Cedar Mills that would test the triplets' abilities in ways no one could have anticipated. The election of Abraham Lincoln had inflamed tensions throughout Ohio, and underground railroad activities were becoming increasingly dangerous. Federal marshals were conducting more frequent raids, and bounty hunters like the Carrot brothers or operating with virtual impunity. It was during this period of height and danger that the boys, now 4 years old, began demonstrate a new and more disturbing aspect of their abilities. They could not only detect selfish and hid emotions in people who were blessed, they seemed sense the emotional distress of people who were miserable. The first documented instance occurred on a bitter January morning when the triplets suddenly became extremely agitated despite being safely inside the warm meeting house with their usual caregivers. All 3 boys began crying simultaneously, not the normal crying of absent children, but a keen wail that seemed to express grief and desperation. More thought more tried everything she could think of to calm them, but nothing worked. The boys continued their distress crying for nearly 6 hours, finally falling silent just as the sun began to set. 2 days later, a freedom seeker arrived at the meeting house with devastated news. A group of 11 people, including 3 children, had been captured by slave catchers approximately 40 miles south of Cedar. The capture had occurred at almost exactly the same time the triplets had begun their crying. Worse, the capture could include a pregnant woman who had given birth during the attack. Both mother and child had died from exposure during the brutal journey back to Kentucky. Samuel Whitmore was shaken by this incident but dismissed it as coincidence until it happened 3 weeks later. This time, the boys' stress lasted only 9 hours but was even more intense. When word arrived the following day, they learned that a conductor on the Underground Railroad had been shot and killed while helping a family escape near Botsam, Ohio. At the exact time the triplets had begun show signs of extreme stress. Dior Harris, who had been documented the boys' development, was called to examine them after this such incident. His findings, recorded in his private notes, were deeply unsettling. During the episodes of apparent long-distance distress sense, the boys' breaths become synchronized, their breathing patterns identical, and their body temperatures drop by several degrees. Most remarkably, their brain activity appears to increase dramatically. They all clearly experience an intense mental stimulation despite a beer that would lead stress. I can only conclude that their nerve systems or somehow detect in motion trauma at a great distance. Though the mechanism by which this occurs is completely unknown to medical science. The boys' long-distance sensor abilities seem to be specifically tuned to situations involving disturbance, betrayal, and mortal danger. They never reacted to ordinary accidents or natural deaths, but they invariably detected when someone was being hunted, betrayed, or murdered. Their range appeared to extend throughout most of southern and central Ohio and possibly into northern Kentucky. Word of the triplets' abilities spread beyond the Underground Railroad network. Families with missing loved ones began making pilgrimages to Cedar Mills, hoping that the boys could somehow sense whether their missing family members were still alive and where they might be found. Samuel Whitmore was reluctant to exploit the children's abilities in this way, but the boys themselves seemed drawn to these desperate families. The most remarkable case involved the Bryan family, whose 16 شرطة شرطة والدaughter Mary had disappeared while traveling to visit relatives in Columbus. The girl had been missing for 3 months when her parents arrived in Seed Mills, having heard rumors about 3 children who could find lost people. Samuel initially refused to involve the boys, but Caleb, later, uneasily approached the distraught parents on their own. Without being asked, the triplets lined up in front of a Morris Bryan and began their characteristic synchronized whisper. After several minutes, Isaac stepped forward and pointed southeast toward the Ohio River. "She's there," he said simply. "She's scared, but she's alive." The man who took her isn't who he said he was. Acting on this information, local authorities searched a remote farm near Chillicothe and found Mary Bryan locked in a cellar along with 2 other young women who had been kidnapped by a man posed as a traffic preacher. The kidnapper was arrested and later confessed to planning to sell the women to prostitution knowledge. The rescue of Mary Bryan marked a turning point in how the community viewed the triplets. No longer were they simply children with new ability to detect light. They were becoming something else entirely, something that made their curricular coordinates profoundly uncomfortable. The boys' abilities were growing stronger and more specific with each passing month, and there seemed to be no limit to their range or accuracy. But perhaps most disturbing was the boys' increased emotional detachment from the world around them. The constant awareness of the selfish, failures, and human suffering was taking stock. They rarely smiled, seldom play, and spent most of their time headed together, whisper than their brave language. When they did interact with the deaths, their conversations were marked by a wisdom and sadness that seemed impossible children sewing. Dior Harris, in his final notes about the boys before his death in 1862, wrote, I fear that we are witness of the emergence of human beings who are fundamentally different from the rest of our species. Their abilities appear to be expanded rather than stabilized, and I cannot predict what they might become capable of as they mature. More troubling is the psychological cost of their gifts. These children were bear witnessed more human suffer than most deaths encounter in a lifetime, and they are doing so that the emotion defenses that deaths develop over time. I do not know what kind of men they will become, but I fear they will be manipulated from all others, for isolated by their terrible knowledge of what lies hidden in the human heart. The outbreak of the Civil War in 1861 brought unprecedented chaos to Ohio's underground railroad operations, but it also created new opportunities for the Triplets to demonstrate the true extent of their extraordinary abilities. As Union and Confederate forces began moving through the border regions, the boys started pivotal reactions to military activities that defied all logical explanation. Samuel Whitmore first noticed this new development during the summer of 1861 when 6-year-old Kyle Lazar and Lazar began showing signs of extreme agitation for several days running. The boys would stand at the meeting halls when joking sat toward the Ohio River, their faces marked by expressions of horror that seemed far too mature for their ears. When Samuel asked what was troubling them, Isaac, who was the most vocal of the three, simply said, too many people were killed that day. So many people. 3 days later, news arrived of the first Battle of Bull Run, where Union forces had suffered a devastating defeat. The time was impossible to dismiss as coincidence, especially when similar incidents began occur with increasing frequency. The boys seemed to sense major military engagements days or weeks before news of the Marsh Cedar Mills, and their emotional reactions corresponded precisely to the scale of casualties involved. More disturbing was their apparent ability to detect specific individuals among the thousands of soldiers moving through the region. In September of 1861, a young Union soldier named Thomas Caldwell stopped at the meeting house while traveling home on left to visit his family in Missouri. The Triplets took one look at him and immediately began their synchronized whisper, their faces showing expressions of profound sadness. More Whitmore, Navin Harsettunas but still serve as the boys to primary caregiver, asked them what they sensed about the soldier. Lazar stepped forward and spoke in a face that seemed too old for his small body. He won't make it home. The man who's supposed to be his friend will shoot him for his many last days from near the river course. Thomas Caldwell laughed when told of the prediction, claimed that he was traveling alone and had no money or still. But 3 days later, his body was found near a river course 20 miles east of Cedar Mills. He had been shot and robbed by a deserter from his own unit, a man named Batters, who had claimed to be Caldwell's friend and had arranged the travel board of the war with him. The accuracy of this prediction sent show through the local community. But it was only the beginning. Over the following months, the boys began making increasingly specific and disturbing predictions about people they encounter. They could tell when someone would die, of doubt the denial. They could predict betrayals, desertions, and acts of violence with an accuracy. Most children of all, then seemed to know which of the freedom seekers passing through the meeting house would successfully reach Canada and which would be captured or killed along the way. Samuel Whitmore struggled with the moral implications of the boys' knowledge. Should he warn people of the dangers the Triplets foresaw? Should he try to prevent the tragedies they predicted? Or was this knowledge too dangerous to act upon? The weight of these decisions was crushing, made worse by the boys' apparent indifference to the suffering they witnessed. They reported this and betrayals with the some detachment they met used to comment on the weather. The turning point came in the spring of 1862 when a group of 12 freedom seekers arrived at the meeting house, led by a conductor named James Morris, whom Samuel had worked with for years. Morris was a trusted ally, a man who had successfully killed hundreds of people to freedom over the course of a decade. But when the Triplets saw him, their reaction was immediate and fear. All 3 boys began screaming the moment Morris entered the meeting hall, a sound unlike anything they had ever met before. It wasn't a crying of distressed children, but something primal and terrifying, like the warning cause of animal sense of mortal danger. They screamed and pointed at Morris, their faces contorted with expression of pure horror. Morris was baffled and offended by the reaction. He had never encountered anything like it from the boys, who had always been coming his brothers door of brief visits. Samuel tried to question the triplets about what they sensed, but they could only repeat over and over, death. He brings death. So much death. Despite the boys' warnings, Samuel was reluctant to turn away a trusted conductor and 12 desperate freedom seeker. Morris insisted that he had bought the cub safely from Kentucky and was prepared to get them on to the next stage. The 12 freedom seekers, men, women, and children generally from 8 seemed genuinely desperate and showed no signs of disabling. But the triplets' agitation only intensified as the years passed. They refused to enter the basement while Morris and his cub were there, and they continued their disturbing predictions. Tomorrow night in the wood by Miller's Creek, he'll call them, and they'll toss him because they think he's their friend. But the man with cans will be wilt. Samuel faced an impossible choice. Either trust the word of 3 young children whose abilities he did understand, or risk the lives of 12 people best what might be nothing more than childhood intuition. In the end, he chose a compromise that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He led Morris and the cub to continue their journey but sent word ahead the next stage, warned them to be cautious. He also arranged for 2 local men to follow at a distance, ostensibly to provide additional secure. What they witnessed the following night would validate the triplets, warned in the most horrific way possible. Morris led the cub at a clear near Miller's Creek, just as the boys had predicted. There, instead of guiding them toward the next stage, he caught it in the darkness. Within minutes, armed safe catchers emerged from the woods. The freedom seekers realized they had been betrayed, but it was too late to escape. In the chaos that followed, 12 people were killed at rate, including 2 children. They remained 4 captured and dragged back to Kentucky in chains. The 2 men Samuel had sent to provide security witnessed the entire massacre from a distance, 2 forward intervened but caused enough to see Morris collect a substantial payment from the leader of the slave catchers. James Morris, the trusted conductor who had killed hundreds to freedom, had been working as a double agent for months, selling information about underground railroad operations and lead cubes into carefully planned ambushes. When news of the massacre reached Cedar Mills, the entire community was devastated. 7 people were dead, 5 more were condemned slavery, and one of their most trusted allies had been revealed as a traitor. But perhaps most disturbing was the realization that 17 children had known exactly what would happen and their warners had been ignored. The triplets' reaction to the news was unlike anything Samuel had ever seen from them. Instead of their usual calm detachment, they showed genuine emotion for the first time in years, not sadness or anger, but a deep, profound disappointment that seemed to encompass not just the immediate tragedy but something much larger about the nature of human evil. People nevertheless, Isaac said quietly, speaking for all 3. They never want to believe what we can say. They think we're just children, but we've seen more than anyone in this room. We know what people are capable of when they think no one is watching. The boys were hand their like a pronouncement of judgment, and Samuel realized that something fundamental had changed. The triplets were no longer just children with unusual abilities. They had become something else entirely, something that could see into the darkest corners of human nature with perfect care. And that terrible knowledge was transforming them into beings that were increasingly alien to the rest of humanity. Just when Samuel thought he'd seen the full extent of what the boys were capable of, events would soon prove that their abilities were still full fun, still cold stronger. The question was no longer what they could perceive, but what they might become, and whether the community that had raised them would be able to surface the truth of what they really were. The rifle that would forever change how the world understood the triplets came during the brutal winter of 1863 when the boys were 8 years old and the Civil War had reached its bloodiest phase. The Lord Elizabeth Hartwell, one of the first female physicians in Ohio and a specialist in neurological conditions, had been studying the boys for 6 months under the auspices of the Medical College of Ohio. Dr. Hartwell's interest had been sparked by reports from Dr. Harris before his death, and she had convinced Samuel Whitmore to let a comprehensive medical examination of the triplets. What she'd discovered in that examination would child Jeffrey سنبش rebellion consciousness and perception. User latest medical instruments available in 1863. Dior, how to conducted tests that revealed the true nature of the boy's abilities. Our findings, documented in a detailed report that was immediately classified by military authorities and hid from public view for over 2 years, showed that the triplets possessed neurological structures that had never been observed in human beings. The boy's brain showed abnormally high activity in regions associated with pattern recognition and emotion process. But more remarkably, their nerve systems appeared to be in constant communication with each other. When Dior, how to blade made electrical stimulation to one boy's arm, the other two showed immediate physiological responses despite being in separate rooms. Their heart rates, breathing patterns, and brain with synchronized during periods of intense concentration, created what she described as a single consciousness distributed across 3 separate bodies. But the most startling discovery came when Dior, how to began to study the boy's ability to detect the cerebration using carefully controlled experiments. She arranged for volunteers to both true and false statements while the boys observed, measured their physiological responses to each type of interaction. What she found defied all understanding of human sensory capabilities. The triple sort simply read facial expressions, body language, or focal cues detected. They all responded to measurable changes in electromagnetic fields generated by human neutral activity. Dior, how to use primitive instruments detect that the boy's brains interacted electrical patterns and like anything seen in normal humans, and these patterns seemed to resonate with the electromagnetic signatures of other people's emotion states. In simple terms, Dior, how to wrote in her classified report, these children appear to possess a form of biological electromagnetic sensitivity that allows them to directly perceive the electrical activity of other human brains. When someone lies, experiences fear, or harbors failed intentions, their neutral activity creates specific electromagnetic signatures that the boys can detect with the same accuracy that we might observe colors or hair sounds. This explained not only their ability to detect this ambush but also their capacity to sense emotion and stress at great distances and their uncanny accuracy in predicted failed events. They weren't prophets or supernatural beings. They were human beings with sensory capabilities that had evolved far beyond normal human limitation. But there are, how to always discoveries raise if more disturbing questions. If the boys' abilities were the result of genetic mutation, what had caused such a dramatic revolutionary leap? The answer came from analyzing 2 samples from their deceased mother, Ruth, whose body had been preserved in the Methodist cemetery. According to local tradition, medical examination of Ruth's remains revealed that she had been exposed to mass doses of sulfur industrial chemicals during her pregnancy, chemicals that were commonly used in the process of indigo on cedar plantations. These chemicals, which include mercury compounds and lead-based pigments, had caused severe neurological damage in Ruth but had appeared later recurred unprecedented genetic changes in her unborn child. The boys represented something entirely new in human flesh, a mutation that might normally have been lethal but had still created enhanced sensory capabilities. They were left from proof that human consciousness and perception could fulfill with that science had never imagined possible. Dior, how to always find a revelation was perhaps the most chill. Based on her analysis of the boy's genetic structure, she concluded that their enhanced abilities were not limited to their generation. The genetic changes that had created their electromagnetic sensitivity were dominant traits that would be passed on to their children and their children's children. We all witnessed the birth of a new branch of human flesh, she wrote in her most confidential notes. These boys will father children with similar abilities. And those children will be more sensitive to human electromagnetic fields. Within 3 or 4 generations, their descendants may possess sensory capabilities that will make human perception seem primitive by comparison. The implications are staggering. If Dior, how to was correct, the triplets were just medical curiosities. They were the beginning of a new human subspecies. And if their abilities continued to rise with each generation, their descendants might eventually be able to read human thoughts as easily as observing facial expression. But the most immediate concern was what to do with this knowledge. The Civil War was raging, and both Union and Confederate forces would be desperate to exploit the boys' abilities for military intelligence. If word of the capabilities spread beyond the small curricular community, the triplets would become valuable assets to be captured, studied, and used as weapons. Samuel Whitmore faced an impossible decision. Dior, Hartwell was prepared to publish her findings, which would bring international attention to the boys but would also ensure their safety through public scrutiny. Alternatively, the research could be suppressed, protecting the boys to privacy from them vulnerable to those who already know of their abilities. The decision was made for the month A code February more and known further Marshall's consider Mills with orders to bring the triplets to Washington for consultation on matters of national security. Someone in the military hierarchy had learned of Dior, Hartwell's research and said that the boys' abilities could be valuable for interrogating Confederate prisoners and detecting Confederate spies. But the triplets had sensed the Marshals' approach long before they reached the meeting house. When Samuel found the boys that morning, they were already packed and ready to leave, their few possessions banded in circular sacks. "We have to go," Caleb said simply. "If we stay, bad things will happen to everyone here. We've seen it." Isaac nodded gruffly. "The men who were coming don't just want justice. They want studies, kids up, see how we work. And when they're done with us, they'll come for our children and our children's children." Heather, "Over the quietest of the three," spoke last. "We've seen the future they want to create. How do our people like us or kept in cages and used as tools? We won't let that happen." The boys, decision was final. They would disappear before the further marshes arrived, vanishing into the network of caves and hidden passages that rid the hills and cedar mills. Samuel made one last desperate attempt but convinced them to stay, arguing that they would be safer under government protection than hiding in the wilderness. Caleb's response revealed just how much the boys had matured beyond their 8 years. "The more, Whitmore, we can sense the intentions of every person within 50 miles of this place. We know that the government may not come to protect us. They're coming to turn us. We felt their thoughts, and we know what they'll plan to do. We'd rather take our chances in the way than become prisoners in the laboratory." As the sound of approaching horses echoed across the forest fields, the triplets prepared to leave.